I'm going to talk about a project that I'm trying to make happen, and I'm hoping that some of the people in this room can help make that happen. And really, I want to talk about love and ambition, and they're not often talked about these days, love and ambition, and especially in this time of crisis. And I think actually what we're experiencing and what I'm experiencing personally is that the ethical and financial and ecological crisis are combining to, in some ways, kind of wake us up to love and ambition and reintroduce them to us. And I think a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. So I'm going to try and make the most of it while I'm here. This is really what I want to talk about today. Centers for Massive Change. It's interesting. What we've seen so far, a lot of it has been about change. It's about our capacity to solve problems. And what's very interesting to me is that even people who typically are not in that business, like people in advertising, are waking up to it and starting to say, well, actually, maybe we've got this incredible capacity to affect the world, and we should think about what that effect is going to be, and not simply do it without consideration. So that's what the idea of the Center for Massive Change is all about. And what I want to do is kind of tell you a little bit of a story about how I got to this concept and what we're hoping to do. I start with this extraordinary quotation from Hannah Arendt, 1968. Education is the point at which we decide whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it, and by the same token save it from the ruin which, except for renewal, except for the coming of the new and young, would be inevitable. And education, too, is where we decide whether we love our children enough not to expel them from our world and leave them to their own devices, not to strike from their hands their chance of undertaking something new, something unforeseen by us, but to prepare them in advance for the task of renewing a common world. When I found this quotation quite recently, and when I read it, I thought, wow, someone has put together, so somehow everything I think about life into a few sentences. The idea that there's a moment where we decide that we love the world is, for me, a kind of central idea. And secondly, the idea that we love our children. These two, if we can sort of think about those two ideas as the kind of core ideas that drive our work. So often we get caught up in the brief and the product and the messaging and the branding and what we're trying to do, instead of pulling back and saying, well, what are we actually committed to in our life? What are we trying to achieve? And when I found this, I thought, this is it. These two decisions are the key decisions that we need to make. And if we draw everything back to those decisions, we can start to measure what we're doing and get a sense of whether or not we're doing things that are actually supportive of those ideas. This is another quotation from an extraordinary man that I've really looked at a lot in terms of his work, a Canadian thinker. We have now become aware of the possibility of arranging the entire human environment as a work of art, as a teaching machine designed to maximize perception and to make everyday learning a process of discovery. If you think about what you just saw, what they're really working towards is this kind of experience. This is 1967, and you go back, you look at what people were trying to do then, it's absolutely staggering how radical it really was. To think about designing the entire human environment as a work of art. Really very, very great way of thinking. This is a quotation from a man named David Orr, who's a really great person thinking about education these days. Can we imagine education that doesn't alienate us from life in the name of human domination, separate feeling from intellect, and I'm going to have to swallow that fly in a moment, and deaden the sense of wonder for the created world? I mean, can you imagine what he's asking for? Can we invent a form of education that doesn't have these effects of alienation? And finally, Lester Brown's new book, kind of new version of his book, Plan B 3.0. Towards the end of the book, he says massive change is inevitable. And I think you can see from the presentation you've seen today that that's exactly what is going on. That we're living through something that is probably the best time in human history to be alive and working. And the opportunities that we have really not been seen by any human generation before us. So about 4 or 5 years ago, I started a project called Massive Change, and it was about this capacity, our capacity to affect change. And if you think about where the red dot goes on that diagram, our answer is the whole thing is a red dot. There isn't a dot that goes anywhere. Actually, you have to scale it up and think of the whole enterprise as a design project. We looked at it in the broadest sense and said, let's forget about design and its formal questions. Let's look at design in our capacity to affect and shape the world. What's happening and what are the new responsibilities that go with that? If you think about what's happening and our capacity to affect change, do we have new responsibilities? Is there a new discussion that needs to be taking place? And that's really what the project set out to do. We found several things that were quite alarming and quite extraordinary in very positive ways. The first one was this. It came from a man named E.O. Wilson, who's one of the greatest life scientists working today. He did a study and he said, if we simply rolled out the American way of life to 6 billion people, we would need 4 additional planet Earths to do it. So at first you think that's the worst news I've heard this afternoon, but in fact it's maybe the best, because it means we won't do that. It takes it off the table as a kind of imaginary possibility, which I think still a lot of people today working around the world still believe somehow that that's effectively what we're going to do. He said, actually, status quo ain't going to do it. We have to redesign, rethink everything that we do, and that's exactly what we're undertaking. We met a man named Ray Kurzweil, who's a scientist and researcher. He's an inventor, and he did an incredible study and showed that something like 90% of inventions fail. And he wanted to understand, why are the smartest people in society who can invent the solutions failing so frequently? And what he discovered is that they're inventing things where the context is not ready. So he wanted to understand, well, how fast is the context changing? How fast are we developing new capacity? And what he discovered is so startling that it explains many of the kind of effects and questions and issues that we're dealing with right now, and that you saw earlier today. He discovered that we're doubling our technological capacity every 12 months. So we're doubling our capacity to move information, images, to connect people, to make machines that make machines. What that means is that we're cutting in half the time it takes to do things every 12 months. He said what it will be like, the 21st century will be like living through 20,000 years of human progress. Not 100, 20,000 years of human progress in 1 century. We discovered also that the idea in that context, when you're moving that much information, there's no longer back of house. The idea that somehow you can have an image or a brand or a design that is an image or an object out front, and back of house you can do whatever you want, and it's not relevant. That idea is over. It's an idea that It's a 20th century, 19th century idea. Many people still work with it. Many people don't connect the dots, but kids do. They will go into your organization, they'll go into your business, and they will connect the dots between what you say and what you do. And if they're at odds, they will strip you bare. And the example that we use is Nike. Nike had probably the best branding and imaging in the world. But Backofhouse, they were using child labor. Kids got in and they connected the dots, and they stripped billions of dollars out of that business in the space of a few weeks. And if you Google child labor today, Nike will come up near the top of the list. They've now become one of the leading companies in the world at controlling supply chain management, so that they can actually regulate workplace practices and get child labor out of their product. But it's still something that very much sticks to them. So what this means is that there's no longer zones or parts of our work that are not design problems, which again goes to that. If you think about that diagram, design isn't happening at the end or at the beginning. It's actually all of it's design. Where we find the material is a design problem. And that just radically changes what a designer does. And we discovered that design is no longer only visual. When we started the project, we went to the museum. It was commissioned by the Vancouver Art Gallery. We went to the museum and said, look, we want to make a design exhibition that is not about the visual. And, when they got up off the floor, we said, well, look, it's like this. If you think of the design of this object, most people would say it's the shape. It's the heavy base that provides, and it's the kind of formal shape of it. And what we realized is that that's not the design at all. In fact, the design is like a still. What we think of design, the form of it, is like a still from a movie. The movie is, how does energy and matter come together with intelligence, form this object, provide a certain utility and delight for a certain amount of time, and then what happens when that breaks and we want to get that material, that matter and energy back into the system. So how do we make this kind of flow? And what you realize is that cycle is actually the design. That continuous flow of material is the real design project. And the object is like a still from the movie that is the real design. So to think about design from a formal perspective, you're almost always looking at the wrong problem. So what we did is we said, let's just take the formal off the table. We'll focus on this new kind of human capacity. What's our capacity to affect change, and think of it in this new way? And what happens is that the formal comes racing back in, and it kind of gives you this new aesthetic of capacity that you've just never seen before. And it really is a very different way of looking at design and thinking about it. And then the last thing we realized is that we thought for a long time in a very short-term way. I mean, still so much of design is about fashion and the current kind of language and culture. But the new design is really about getting to a new state, which is perpetuity. Currently, practically nothing we do, we can do indefinitely. Almost everything that we do today, we rely on exhausting resources that are not indefinite. So we know that we're doing things in ways that have a really limited time frame, and in fact, in some cases, very limited. One of the things that we do in our work is to work with a company and say, look, let's just run the numbers. We'll look at your business right now, and we'll run the numbers for 50 years. What happens? What waste do you produce? What kind of outputs do you generate? What do you leave in the environment? Right? And when you start to look in those kinds of time frames, the impacts are absolutely staggering. So we have to think about design getting to an entirely new place that is extraordinarily challenging. It's not like someone can walk in today and say, we can take your business to sustainability in 24 months. It's looking at it saying, wow, this is 10 or 20-year project to undertake rethinking how we do things. So to do that work, to do massive change, we started the Institute Without Boundaries. And the idea was very simple. We said, there's no way that we can do this kind of research. We did, in the end, about 20 person-years of research to produce massive change. The way that we're going to do that is we're going to form an interdisciplinary team, and we're going to design a new design education model, and we called it the Institute Without Boundaries. And we set it up inside our studio. So we had about 14 students over 2 years who came into the studio, spent a full 12 months working with us on this project. And it really was a kind of life-changing experience. It totally reoriented our work. It opened up entirely new ways of thinking and working. It challenged us in almost everything that we do. And we fell in love with these extraordinary people who were young people who wanted to become designers from all different walks of life. I mean, we had a professional squash player. We had people from architecture. We had communication people, scientists, very diverse range of people. And we did this project together, and it really was, as I said, it really was an incredible experience. And the whole idea of it was to set up a very, very ambitious project that would draw out of them the absolute maximum performance. And it really worked. It was it was quite an experience. It was a 20,000 square foot exhibition in Vancouver, Toronto, and Chicago. In both Chicago and Vancouver, it was the best attended exhibition that either of those museums had ever mounted. We did the whole thing as a collaborative process. So it was in the studio, and the whole idea was that we didn't know how to do it. And there were times when, I would come into the studio, and the students were there, and they were furious that I wouldn't tell them what to do. And my staff would come to me and say, "Look, Bruce, you got to talk to these guys because, they're going to kill you." And I very rarely raise my voice, but there was a moment in that process where I really had to talk to them and say, "Look, this is not about, this is not something you can Google. Right? This is something we have to learn. We have to go out there and find it and find out what's going on. And the whole idea is that I don't know. If I did, I wouldn't tell you because I'd be stealing your money." So the whole idea of this form of education is that we're going to find out together. So in the course of doing that, one of the students, Jennifer Leonard, started a radio program called Massive Change Radio, where once a week we would interview people around the world. And we tried to get people to talk to our students. And I'd call them up and say, "Look, could you spend an hour talking to the students?" They'd hang up on me. But when we called and said, "Look, we're doing a radio program and we'd like to talk to you," they would say, "Only if I could have the full hour." So it was a really devious and successful way of getting people to talk to us. And it allowed us to learn a huge amount. And all those interviews are now archived on the website. We did an exhibition that, as I said, that traveled around. And it was organized around what we call design economies, or regions of the world that are being reinvented, redesigned, and in some cases designed and invented fresh. So this is the exhibition component about the image economy. This is about the design of the market. The market is not a natural space. It's a space of design. It's designed, and how we design it determines what happens there. And we featured in this part of the exhibition 11 people and organizations who are redesigning the market. And we featured Muhammad Yunus before he won the Nobel Prize for his work on reconceiving microlending and telephony in India. And we ended it with a gallery, an exhibition on the redesign of wealth, of wealth and politics. And the idea here is that what's really going on in these new design capacities is that wealth itself is being reconceived and redesigned. We still think of wealth as capital, and that's certainly one way of measuring it. But what we saw was that, in fact, we're inventing new forms of wealth, and we're distributing those forms of wealth in ways that that have really never happened in human history. And we're inventing all sorts of new forms of wealth. So capital is one way of looking at it, but we're now thinking about wealth in a much more broad and exciting way. I want to just touch on another project that we did that really came out of massive change, and you'll see where this goes in a moment. We were called to Guatemala by a citizens group that asked us about working with them to change the way that people in Guatemala imagine their future. And they said, when our people think of the future, they've had 36 years of civil war. When they imagine the future, they think of three things: violence, poverty, and corruption. Those three images dominate their imagination. They can't see a positive image that they can work towards. We need to, we'd like to know if you could work with us to undertake something like this. I have to say that it was one of the most touching and exciting things that had ever appeared on my desk. And we got involved with them, and the first thing that we did, we went down, a few days later. I got this incredible call. A few days later, our whole family went down to Guatemala. They took me to meet the vice president, and they said, "This is Bruce, and he's going to redesign Guatemala." I said, we got to have we need some time, because that's not going to happen. And if anyone tells you that is going to happen, you should, run away. So I said, what can happen is that we have a lot of tools. We have a lot of techniques for using design in a new way, using design to affect change, using design to communicate, using design to organize and order and imagine new things. That we can do. But if this isn't a Guatemalan project, there's no point in doing it. I'm going to get on a plane. These aren't my problems. I'm going to get on a plane. I'm going to go back to where I live. And as much as I, love being here and love, working with you guys, I'm out of here at some point. The problems remain, and you're here in your country. And they said, okay, well, let's change the name of the country then. And I said, well, that's probably not the best place to start. And we started this incredible conversation. They said, look, Guatemala, the slang for the place is Guate. Mala means bad. They said, how would you like it if you woke up every day in a place called Bad Place? And so somewhere along the way in our kind of brainstorm discussion, and it kind of illustrates the whole collaborative approach that we take, somebody put an A into the word and created this Guatemala, which means the love of Guate. And it was a very simple addition that radically changed the idea and expressed the whole idea of the project. So we worked with them to do a project and we said, look, what you really have is that you've got, thousands and even hundreds of thousands of people working on these problems, but they're all invisible. Somehow you can't see them. If people knew that was going on, they would be part of it, and they would believe in it, and they would start to work on it themselves. And so we developed this program called the Culture of Life that had a kind of series of foundations. We said, you don't just kind of, after 36 years of civil war, where half of your population is under 15 years old, meaning they've never experienced anything else, you don't just turn it off and say, okay, now we're good. Now that the war is over, we'll be fine. You have to actually build all the institutional foundations that in many countries we take for granted. And so we developed this project with them called the Culture of Life. And they did a whole series of projects to kind of build this idea and build membership. They did an event in the center of Guatemala City where they built an exhibition about all the people across the country who are working to make this happen already, featuring 200 heroes of this new way of thinking. Our ambition was to get 1,000 people to sign up, to be volunteers, to join this project and help work with us. What we achieved in 10 days was 11,000 people, way more than anyone anticipated, and we were not in any way prepared to deal with 11,000 volunteers. So we had to have a series of emergency meetings and sort of design a way to kind of integrate this new kind of force. The person that we worked with, Emilia Mendez, was an extraordinary character who was named Person of the Year in Guatemala, largely for his work. And it became a Guatemalan project, and it now is moving around the country and even to other places in the world where large populations of Guatemalans live. So those two projects give you a sense of sort of where we're coming from in terms of how we see design. And then this happened. And this in some ways changes everything. What happened to us was that leading up to the Democratic Convention in Denver, we got a call from the people organizing the events in Denver about doing an event during the Democratic Convention about the possibility of a sustainable America. So could you imagine, could you imagine an America where 6% of the world's population doesn't consume 26% of the world's resources? And when I first said sustainable America, it kind of broke off and fell to the ground because it seemed so crazy as an idea. When you say, oh yeah, sustainable America. And I realized that, in fact, unless we make that, unless we pick those words up, and are somehow able to float them in the air in some kind of plausible way and make it not seem crazy, we're really doomed. That unless we can actually conceive of a sustainable way, we're really, it's only going to get much worse. So we went to Denver and we had an extraordinary experience there. We did a Green Constitutional Congress as part of this bigger project called Dialogue City that was all around the city about, sort of thinking about what's going on. And it was quite an exceptional experience for me. Just being there, I'm a Canadian, and being in the kind of beating heart of the American political context was quite something. We were actually, my wife and I actually went to the convention where Obama actually made his acceptance speech. And we met and worked with this man. His name is John Hickenlooper. He's the mayor of Denver. And he's doing a thing called political karaoke, where he actually does an imitation of an Obama speech. It's a pretty funny thing to watch. He's a really wonderful guy who's very, very down to earth. And he said, look, we want to make a new event in Denver. We want to launch a new biennial. And, would you be interested in thinking about what a Denver biennial might be? What would a biennial be in the 21st century? And we said, well, there's about 200 biennials happening around the world right now. What we don't want to do is the number 201. What we'd like to conceive of, if we can, is the first of a new kind of event, the first of a new generation of gathering, of moments where people come together in a way to celebrate what we're capable of and to think about what we can do together. So if you think that would be an exciting way of thinking about it, we'd love to get involved. So for the last few months, we've been working on that, and a few days ago, I guess like 2 weeks ago, we presented it for the first time in Denver to a kind of select public, and got an absolutely wonderful response because we've really reconceived, what a biennial can be. And to start, we said, look, this is the context in which you're working. So this is a chart that shows environmental impact and resource consumption. The red line is population from 1750 to roughly now. And what you can see is what's going on and what all of us are, part of. And there's no way that you can sort of look at this and understand it and say, that's just fine. Carry on. Right? You've got to say, well, we have to mobilize around this. We have to think about this as a serious situation. It's not that we haven't been extraordinarily successful in many, many ways. And we should understand those successes, but we also have to think about, what we're not achieving and what we're accidentally, the impact that we're accidentally having as a result. So we said, look, what we want to do is a project to inspire people to higher possibilities and transforming opportunities, to create platforms for participation. We don't want to put on a show where we present and everyone says, cool, and goes home. That will be an absolute disaster, because our real objective is to change the way we live. That if we live the way we're living now in 50 years, the kind of conflict that you saw presented in the Indian context is going to become nasty, bitter, and global, unless we change the way that we do things. And I'm happy to say we are exactly doing that. And so we called our project In Good We Trust. It's about art, ideas, and action. And it's really about a kind of ethical, hopeful, optimistic possibility for action, and a global movement that is going in that direction. And one of the things we saw in Massive Change was that we're not the first people here. We're not the first people to declare this. This thing is like a global movement. It's happening on 1,000 different registers, and all sorts of people are, in many, many ways, coming together in new ways to make these things happen. And that's really what Denver is all about. So we started to identify sort of what we think are the kind of central themes, and it's still in development, but we're starting to get a sense of it. The objective is to say, let's identify those themes, let's put together research labs on what's going on. So let's get a good sense of what's happening out there. Who are the innovators? What's really happening? We're going to design experiences so that when you come to Denver and step into this thing, you will change the way that you understand what's actually happening and how you can be involved in it. And then critical part of that is to say, this is actually designing essentially an event that lasts for several weeks. And our kind of central concept is to take the audience out of the position of audience and make them participants, make them part of the movement that we're articulating and developing. And the essential structure that we are working with, and I'd love, if anyone knows of anything that relates to these two things, I really would love to hear about it. The structure is proof and possibility. Proof is, here's what's going on. These people are already doing it, and they're mostly invisible. Almost always I ask about Larry Brilliant. How many people in the audience know Larry Brilliant? Almost no one. Larry Brilliant led the charge to eradicate smallpox. Larry Brilliant should be more famous than Britney Spears. But somehow Larry Brilliant is invisible because of the way that we look at these kinds of things. So we're convinced that we're not doing it, when in fact the opposite is true. So one of the areas we'll focus on is proof. We want to find the Larry Brilliants of the world who are doing the amazing things already. And the second thing is to look at possibility, to look at people who are launching projects to deal with these kinds of issues, who want a rocket sled attached to their project. If you are doing something or you know of someone doing something that is aimed at these kinds of issues, we want to hear from you, because that's what we're trying to promote. And we're starting to get a whole kind of design, really, a whole range of ways of interfacing with these kinds of people and ideas, including a series of international art experiences that are really keyed to the kind of major themes and issues. And in some ways, what we're looking at is the idea that the 21st century doesn't start on the clock that matches the years. That in fact, the 21st century, the last 8 years may have been a kind of hangover of the 20th century. It certainly felt that way if you're in America. And it may be that with the election of Obama and a new kind of energy and a new form of optimism and a connection to the youth of America and the world, that it actually is a new kind of cultural era beginning as of this moment. So what we proposed is that to do the Denver Biennial, we would form the Center for Massive Change, and it really is in some ways inspired by the Institute Without Boundaries. But when I started to talk about this, about doing, basic sort of reconstituting the Institute Without Boundaries for the Denver project, the guy who commissioned me to do the Denver Biennial for the mayor was named Seth Goldenberg. He came to me one day and he had a very unusual thing to say to me. Most people don't accuse me of being old-fashioned. It's not mostly where people think that that I live. They accuse me of a lot of other things, but not usually being old-fashioned. But he said, look, the way that you're thinking about it, it's great. It's terrific what you want to do. The whole idea of a group of students working on this thing, but you're not really using what you talk about in Massive Change to do it. In Massive Change, you talk about all these new possibilities, and now you're going to put 20 students and one teacher or one instructor together to make something. Although it's an incredible thing, you should really think about it in a new way. And he showed me these numbers. He said, look, there are 18,300,000 students in higher education in the U.S. You have 14 students roughly in the Institute Without Boundaries. On that basis, it would take you 1,300,000 years to really affect the students of the United States. So it's probably going to take too long. And I told him about this guy that I met who said, we buy live lectures. I said, what do you mean? This is a guy I met through Frank Gehry's office. He said, we buy live lectures. We go around the world. If someone's really doing interesting work and they're very proficient, we ask them to do lectures in their office. We broadcast them into concert halls in China with 30,000 students across the country. So one teacher, 30,000 students. And he said, if we took all the resources that we need to teach the people of China what we need to teach them, you would hear a giant sucking sound as every teacher in the West was pulled out of their job. So we know that we have to innovate new ways. And so that's led us to this new concept that we call Centers for Massive Change, rather than Center, which when we started to work on this, I hired Seth and said, come and work with me and help me do this. And so that's what we've done. It's purpose-driven entrepreneurial experience education. The whole idea is that when people are attached to purpose, they will learn at a rate that you can't possibly teach them. If they have a purpose to do something, what they will learn is radically greater than anything. If I sat in the room with them for 365 days, I couldn't teach it to them. The idea is diverse post-singular collaboration. The idea that somehow it's about a single designer, a single author, these days are over. The complexity is so great that we need Renaissance teams, not Renaissance people. And so we've formed this new kind of way of assembling people together. It's driven by a project that is very public and very difficult. And that combination of those two elements drives entrepreneurial learning. People have an experience that, they want to get up that hill, and they'll do anything to get there. That's what an entrepreneur does. And once they learn that methodology, they never go back. And one of the things we were thinking of calling it Lost in the Woods Academy, because that's what it's like. There's a difference between being on a picnic and being lost in the woods. When you're lost in the woods, every piece of information is relevant. You want to know where the landscape is sloping, where the sun is, where the water is. You want to know everything. That's the way an entrepreneur behaves. So this is the concept, studio-based immersive learning. And what we discovered is that the strength of the network lies in diversity. So it's, Paul Hawken did a great project called Blessed Unrest. And in that, he documents this movement that is happening of people working together to address the great challenges we face. And he says, look, it's not about a single ideology. It's not about a single solution. It's exactly what we saw in Massive Change. It's not about solving the problem with the solution. It's about developing a whole range of solutions, knowing that ecologically they will sort themselves out. And that's really what the approach has to be. So our ambition is to build a network of centers for massive change that will work to catalyze the points of intersection of this massive change by developing, connecting, and leveraging a series of centers that articulate, visualize, produce, exhibit, teach, share, and measure change. So this is really the objective. This is what we intend to do. And what we've done, what started to happen already is that I presented a similar kind of presentation in Pittsburgh at Carnegie Mellon. And accidentally, I showed them a map of where we were thinking of having it and forgot to put Pittsburgh on the map. And it was a pretty tough dinner that night after the lecture. And they said, why aren't we on the map? Because, Carnegie Mellon is the 18th best university in the world. We should be on that map. And so we realized that we're on to a way of thinking and working that is really touching a nerve. So this is the way that we're thinking of developing it. And again, it's in the kind of formative stages. So we're still thinking, how do we do this? What we do know is that we have this kind of a model, which is a partner institution, our studio, collaborate on a Center for Massive Change that connects to Centers for Massive Change around the world, that undertakes a large-scale public project. In other words, something that is very, very difficult to do any other way, that produces new kind of knowledge and content that is then fed back into the system, which is exactly what happened when we did Massive Change. We've been in discussions with all the places that are on this map, and as you'll see, Pittsburgh is still not on it, which is something that we're going to have to correct. So we're in discussion with all these people to say, how should we do it here? What would the project be that you would undertake with us? And how, what kind of institutions would collaborate? In Denver, for instance, we're working with 4 universities to say, we want to work together to make this. And what we're looking for is a new kind of person that is becoming a designer. It's very interesting. What I saw today is that there's a discussion going on about what is design, where is it, who is it, are we consulting, are we, based on objects? And for me, I think that those questions have to be opened up in the biggest way, to imagine a way of thinking and a way of being that really ties back to those questions that we started with about love for our world and for our children, and for the idea of renewal. So we know that we want this character. We want these people to be part of our project. Our ambition here is to once again have ambition. We're through with defining the role of the arts as being negative, critical, and challenging, and radically marginal and irrelevant. For too long, artists have accepted the role of camping outside the gates of power and lobbing soft, mildly entertaining blobs over the fence, instead of engaging in the very real growing crisis they were sometimes quite aware of. Being critical is part of a method, not an outcome. We can no longer afford the luxury of cynicism. We're not willing to accept the role of the artist as one of tearing things down, as romantic as that seems, and as easy as that sits with our cultural mythology. We demand a new discourse that puts artists and designers, perhaps only new artists are capable of this, at the center of power and life and culture, and the invention and definition of our collective future. Can we launch a Center for Massive Change in South Africa? We're committed to superimposing the arts and sciences, commingling and collaborating and inflecting and changing and redefining both to create a new potent open engagement and hybrid methodology with the best capacities of creativity, research, knowledge, metaphor, image, engagement, and vision. We believe that the most critical discourse we can possibly engage in is to invent a better future. Ways of doing things that are smarter, more equitable, that use less energy and material, are more delightful, more compelling, more beautiful, more exciting and engaging than anything we've done in the past, than anything we have ever imagined. That is the new role for artists and designers, to use their power of creative envisioning to invent an ecological, sustainable, wealthy future for all the people on the planet. If you're an artist who is not afraid to take off the comfortable, archaic definitions and doff the cliches and berets, and embrace the full bandwidth of new possibilities, and use your power and intelligence, your imagination and your poetry, the talents of your heart and mind to invent the future of the world, we want you to join the Center for Massive Change. If you know artists, and you must realize by now that we're not looking for the convention-bound classical operators here. If you know the adventurers and game changers, the creative pioneers, off in the wilderness of real problems, we're looking for them. Let them know there's a movement shaping up that is searching for them as they are searching for it. And I'll be here for several days, and if you want to be part of this in some way, either as a participant, a supporter, a student, an institution, talk to Ravi or me. We'll be here for a few days.